Look at Trump, look at Brexit, look at Salvini, look at Orban, look at Poland, look at all these different forces. Nationalism is on the rise. The pendulum is swinging the other way. We had globalism and it's reached its limit, it's reached its threshold, and now we are returning to nationalism. What is this nationalism? Well, it's the nation state. The nation state was invented with the fall of monarchy in Europe, which for me is the fall of the warrior class. The monarchy in Europe was a hereditary system whereby it wasn't just the kings, it was also the aristocrats who were in power because their ancestors were great warriors. Their ancestors had won the battle, they had won the war, and oftentimes they had fought personally in those wars. Up until the commonality of firearms in Europe, you would fight with swords, and sword fighting was something that you needed to be big and strong and skilled. And so there was an elite warrior class in Europe, which rode horses and bought steel armor and rode around and fought wars and won wars and gained power. And so power in Europe was pretty much militarily determined. It didn't really matter how much money you had. If a bunch of strong warriors could come and defeat you, well, then they would just take your money, and it didn't matter how fanatical you were in your religious beliefs. If they could come and burn down your church and take over, well, then it didn't really matter. There was a sort of military supremacy. Now, of course, we can balance this out in terms of, okay, there were actually religious considerations, or actually merchants did hold a significant amount of power in this respect or that respect. And clearly it evolves over time. I define the beginning of capitalism with Henry VIII and the confiscation of the church properties. But we can look at earlier developments or later developments. Essentially, this is how I look at monarchy. And monarchy is not nationalist. Monarchy is not concerned necessarily with the nation state. Although linguistic and cultural issues do come into play, ethnic issues. So a German king, a German monarch might have an easier time uniting and forming alliances with other German princes. And so it's probably going to be easier in some sense if a German king, a German monarch, wants to unite. It might be easier for a German king to unite with other German princes than it would be for him to unite with French lords or Polish aristocrats or something like that. So, when we look at medieval states, we can certainly see to some extent there is a sort of medieval France. There is sort of a medieval England, a medieval Poland, a medieval Germany. But are these nation states in the sense that the word nationalism defines a nation state? No. They are confederations, they're alliances of different royal powers, essentially of military powers. And to the extent that they coincide with ethnic alliances is coincidental, meaning it is not the foundation of a state. The state was not founded on ethnicity necessarily. Now, again, in certain cases, you look at the Holy Roman Empire was actually called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. So was the Holy Roman Empire a nation state? Well, clearly there was an ethnic component. There was, you could say, a national component. But was that the entire foundation of the state? That is, to be a prince or a lord in the Holy Roman Empire, did you have to be German? No. They had northern Italian lords who were part of the Holy Roman Empire. They had the lords of Burgundy who were French-speaking. You had Switzerland. The land of Switzerland was part of the Holy Roman Empire. You had parts of the Holy Roman Empire that were, I guess you could say, tributaries. The lands of Bohemia and Moravia and parts of Poland were subjugated by the Holy Roman Empire. So it was not a nation state, and imperialism by definition cannot be nationalist. By definition, an imperial state, a state which expands, which conquers, which subjugates other groups and other, governing bodies, by definition, it's not really going to be a nation state. It's always going to encounter different ethnicities and bring them under control. It's not going to be nationalist. So the future, in my perspective, is not nationalist because the past was not nationalist, because the past was fundamentally imperialist, and empire is just the default state of humanity. Empires rise, empires fall, no empire is forever, and it very much coincides with Spengler's idea of civilizations being organic. In the same way you can look at a petri dish and you can see, okay, well, here we've got the Greeks, and the Greeks they show up in Greece, but then they colonize the Mediterranean, and they go into Russia and Spain and Northern Africa and Egypt. And of course, Alexander the Great spreads them out over into Afghanistan. So the Greeks, they're sort of born, they develop, they germinate, then there's kind of this algae bloom, you could say, in a biological model, that the Greeks suddenly explode outward into these new territories, and then they sort of enter into a decline or a stagnation. They don't die off, they don't disappear, they still exist, but they exist in a much more limited capacity, to the point today where we can speak of a Greek state, we can speak of Greek people who speak a Greek language, but are they really even comparable to the Greeks of ancient history? Not in my estimation. They may be in some senses genetically descended from those same people, although some, depends if you're a genetic determinist, maybe you would dispute that, but I'm willing to admit that the modern day Greeks are, in a sense, descended from, in their lineage, from the ancient Greeks, but are they really the same people in a world historical sense? I think not. So the past is imperial and the future will be imperial. So then we have to ask this question, where did nationalism come from? Why do we have nationalism? Why do we have the concept of nation states? Where does that come from? Well, when you understand that the traditional monarchies of Europe were imperial, they were constituted of a warrior class, then you have to understand that the merchant class of Europe, in its desire to become stronger, in its desire to take over the role of governor of Europe, it sought to undermine, first and foremost, the monarchies of Europe. And to undermine the monarchies of Europe, it appealed not to military strength, because the monarchies were supreme in their military strength. So it didn't appeal to military strength, and of course the merchant power already had the money. So who could they form an alliance with in order to undermine the monarchies? Well, they had to use media, they had to use religion, they had to use ideology. I wish I had a better term, an all-encompassing term. You could say mentalism, you could say the priestly structure is maybe the best way to put it. But in any case, they basically invented this ideology of nationalism, of nation states, in order to undermine the monarchies of Europe. That was the purpose of it. That is why they invented it. That is why it appealed to them. They invented it not because they loved the peoples of Europe and they loved the concept of the nation state. They invented it because they hated the monarchs of Europe. They hated the military supremacy of these military dictatorships which had existed in Europe for so long. They hated the fact that they were Christian. They hated the fact that they were pious and religious and virile. They hated all these aspects because they were merchants, and to the extent that there were also priests in this national movement, they hated it because they were priests. They resented it. They resented their power. They thought they had not won this power by meritocracy. They believed, as good liberals, that power should not be decided by force of arms. It should not be a Ragnar Redbeard style, might makes right system. No, power should be decided by meritocracy. Power should be decided by who has the right ideas. Power should be decided ultimately by whoever has the most money, whoever can succeed in the free market. So this was the idea of the merchants and priests united together in this ideology of liberalism and of nation states and nationalism. This is what they formed. This is what they came together and made. So you'd have people like Bruno Bauer and Giuseppe Mazzini and Wilhelm Marr and Mr. Wagner and all of these early figures of nationalism and nationalist ideology. And they were funded by these big newspapers, these big publications, and these conglomerates and you look at the 1848 revolution in Germany and elsewhere. Now, the revolution itself was not very successful. There was only one lasting law that came out of the 1848 revolution. Of all the different, they said, oh, we should have nation states, we should have democracy, we should have this, we should have that. Well, there was only one act or one set of laws which were passed and which remained passed after the 1848 revolution. Maybe you can guess what that law was. It was the law of emancipation. The law of emancipation struck down the traditional Christian structure of Europe, which said that things like only Christians can own land, or only Christians can have the right to vote, or something like that. And that was what was struck down. So the 1848 revolution was first and foremost composed of atheists and Marxists and nationalists. And at that time, these ideologies were not differentiated. At that time, they sprang from the same source. They sprang from the resentment of merchants and priests against the traditional warrior aristocracy of Europe. That's how it came about. Now, you can say that's a positive development. You could say this has led to a more peaceful world, a better world, a world of less violence, a world of less war, a world of less abuse and punishment and corporal punishment, a world in which we're free in our sexuality, a world in which we're free to choose whatever religion we would like. We can choose whatever kind of consumer culture, sort of niche identity. If we want to identify as bronies or gay or transgender or fans of this sports team or fans of that sports team or fans of Quidditch and fans of Harry Potter. Basically, we're allowed to be whoever we want to be because there's no military dictatorship telling us all to be Christians. And that was what was undermined. And I don't think there's any going back to that, by the way. As I describe this process, I'm doing so in as visceral a way. I'm trying to really emotively bring out or tease out the fact that there was a very willful motivation here. This was not just history as a constellation of inert material interests in a very dry, boring, historical. I mean, we could reframe everything in those terms, but I'm trying to bring out, in a sense, that the fact that there was real hatred, there was real resentment, there was real anger and jealousy and envy that motivated these revolutions that were promulgated by nationalists and nationalist ideologues. Karl Marx was a nationalist. Karl Marx believed in a pan-German state, a pan-Scandinavian state, a pan-Slavic state. Democrats, anarchists, Republicans, liberals, all of these people believed in nationalism. Now, what happened afterward, which is where people really get confused and stupid, is when they say, oh, well, communism is about internationalism and nationalism is about traditionalism. And they're really stuck in the 20th century, and they're really stuck in this central sacral divide that we have between fascism and communism. And they make out all of history, they reduce it to fascism versus communism, which is a very superficial analysis of history, which ignores the Greeks and the Romans and those who came before them and most of those who came after them. And it says that our entire view of history can be reduced to essentially what happened between, the First World War and the Second World War. And that's how we define right and left determines everything. And so you're either a nationalist or you're a globalist, and that's the valid paradigm. But both of these ideologies, fascism with its nationalism and communism with its internationalism, both spring from liberalism. They're both fundamentally liberal. I believe that Alexander Dugin does point this out to an extent. Of course, Alexander Dugin says, well, instead of maybe a strict form of nationalism, we're going to, fascism was a very strict form of nationalism. Maybe we're going to have civilizationalism. We'll have Eurasianism. We'll have Russia as a civilization. We'll have, the West can be a civilization. Africa can be a civilization. So he's just changing the scale. Libertarian says that the individual has the right to freedom. The nationalist says the nation has the right to freedom. I guess the fourth positionist says the civilization has the right to freedom. This is just a changing of scale. It's not a change of the underlying quality of the arguments being made. So this is the narrowness with which nationalists approach everything by dividing the world up into, well, some people are internationalists and those are evil, and some people are nationalists and those are the good guys. It's a very simple-minded division of the world that can really only be maintained if you myopically focus yourself upon the 20th century. Really, just a few decades that occurred in the 20th century. Nationalism has a very shallow past. And it's going to have a very shallow future in the sense that to the extent that nationalism lives on, it's going to live on in rhetoric. It's not going to live on in actual practical action. So again, what is nationalism? Nationalism is the idea that a state should be composed of a nation, right? So Germany for the Germans, Italy for the Italians. And this is the idea of nationalism. Now, there are a bunch of people using that kind of rhetoric on the internet and in right-wing political parties, but what is the actual effect of all their rhetoric? Well, the actual effect of Germany for the Germans, Italy for the Italians, the actual day-to-day effect is that every single day, Germany becomes more and more an English-speaking country. If you go to a German university, it is not uncommon for classes to be taught in English, or at an Italian university. And it is not uncommon in these big cities to see people who are not of German origin in any kind of national sense. So while this rhetoric in some senses increases on the internet, or it increases in certain right-wing political parties who are jockeying for votes and they're trying to get funding, and it's basically a corporate machine that buys people's votes through electioneering, through campaigning, and then uses these votes to then fund itself to put people in jobs and positions. And then, you know, you have like Sebastian Kurz got in this a political alliance with one of these right-wing parties, and they got embroiled in a scandal where he was promising in exchange for money to do something for the Russian government, which was actually apparently like a fake scheme, like there was a Russian actress was being used. I mean, the whole thing is, you know, some form of entrapment, but really what happened with that Austrian scandal, the Kurtz's coalition government scandal, it wasn't that the right-wing parties are corrupt. It was that the right-wing parties were being targeted in an anti-corruption expose, but the truth is that all the parties are corrupt, that every political party functions in this way, that it gains power through electioneering, through campaigning, and then uses that power to extract favors from lobbyists in exchange for political maneuvers. This is the way that every political party acts. It doesn't matter whether you're right-wing or you're left-wing. To an extent, ideologues will get in there and they'll, you know, try to have some influence. But fundamentally, parliamentarianism and political parties, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, their intention is not to solve the problems that they complain about. Their intention is to exacerbate these problems so that they can fire up their base of support, so that they can get more votes, so that they can get more power, so that they can use this power to exchange favors with lobbyists for money. It's a money scam. That's what parliamentary politics is at the end of the day. And again, you can have a situation where ideologues and good-meaning people try to infiltrate their way into these political parties and actually make them stand up for the principles that they espouse, and you can try to do that. You've seen that with Donald Trump, and you've seen the absolute failure that it's been. You can also see the way that's being done now with Bernie Sanders, and I think that's going to collapse in utter infamy in the same way that it did in 2016. I mean, the Bernie movement was totally betrayed, and I don't expect it to be successful this time around. You know, we can take nuanced positions on these questions, but ultimately, the strength of ideological conviction that, you know, a political party might hold, you know, is always fighting against this basic incentive structure of democratic politics, is that it's a money game. It's a mercantile system created by merchants in medieval Europe. That's where democracy comes from. It's not the Athenian model. The Athenian model, although the Athenians themselves had quite a large merchant class, but the Athenian model was you restrict voting to essentially aristocrats, to what they referred to as citizens. To us would have been landowners, landowning men. The 1% was the conception for the Athenians of who should choose the government. So this is what nationalism is. Nationalism is a scam. The actual material conditions are more and more international. The actual material conditions of Germany, Italy, Poland, Hungary are more and more international. So when you say things like nationalism is winning, well, yeah, it's true. Right-wing parties are winning at the ballot box. But what are the long-term trends? Are the long-term trends toward more homogeneity or less homogeneity? Are the long-term trends toward, the nationalization of the economy, autarky of the economy? Or are the long-term trends toward the internationalization of the economy? You looked at Viktor Orban. Is he furthering integration with the EU or forming an autarky? Well, he's furthering integration. And the further he integrates his economy into the European Union, the more and more his country is going to be beholden to whatever the European Union decides. Brexit happened. What's the result of Brexit? There's two possibilities. Either Britain unites with China, it unites with America, or it reunites with Europe. Britain is not going to stand alone as an autarky. Britain is the definition of a mercantilist state, a mercantile and merchant-led country. It's not going toward nationalism. So we can continue on this track and we can continue to say these things. I think a large percentage of my viewer base already knows all this and this is no news to them. But for people who have never heard these arguments, because I do occasionally have new viewers, maybe this will cause some people to think or try to rebut some of these points. I think that's where I'm going to end it, just for convenience sake. We'll see how that goes.